In the year 1877, in the glittering heart of Rome, the Kingdom of Italy celebrated its new monarch. King Umberto I had ascended to the throne just 3 years earlier, following the death of his father. He was everything a king should be: handsome, dignified, married to his cousin, Queen Margherita, a woman of legendary beauty and grace. Together, they were the perfect royal couple, symbols of a unified Italy still finding its footing as a nation. But beneath the polished surface of court life, beneath the ceremonies and the carefully staged public appearances, there beat a human heart that yearned for something the crown could never provide. It happened at a reception in the Quirinal Palace, on an autumn evening when the air carried the first hint of winter cold. Among the sea of nobility and dignitaries, Umberto's eyes found a woman he'd never seen before. She stood near a window, slightly apart from the crowd, her dark hair caught in an elegant arrangement, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with an intensity that made her seem somehow more present than everyone else in the room. Her name was Eugenia Attendolo Bolognini, Countess of the ancient Attendolo family, whose lineage stretched back to the Condottieri of medieval times. She was married to Count Bolognini, a man 30 years her senior, a union arranged when she was barely 18. She was now 26 years old, cultured, intelligent, and trapped in a marriage as loveless as it was respectable. Their first conversation was brief and proper, conducted under the watchful eyes of courtiers and chaperones. Umberto asked about her family's estates in the countryside. She answered with practiced courtesy, her words careful and appropriate. But there was something in the way she met his gaze, something in the slight pause before each response, that suggested depths beneath the surface. The king found himself thinking about that conversation long after the reception ended, found himself looking for her at subsequent events, found himself inventing reasons to speak with her, always within the bounds of propriety, always surrounded by others, but each exchange carrying an undercurrent of something neither dared to name. It was Queen Margherita who noticed first, with the sharp instinct of a woman who'd spent her life reading the subtle politics of court. She said nothing directly, but her manner toward Eugenia cooled perceptibly. The Countess found herself receiving fewer invitations to intimate palace gatherings, though her presence was still required at large public events where her absence would be noted. Umberto, for his part, tried to maintain proper distance. He was the king. He had duties, responsibilities. His marriage to Margherita was not just a personal union, but a political one, cementing alliances and representing the stability of the young kingdom. He couldn't risk scandal, couldn't allow himself to feel what he was beginning to feel. But the heart, as countless monarchs before him had learned, does not recognize the authority of crowns. The inevitability of their connection unfolded over months, like a flower opening despite being planted in stony ground. A dance at a state ball where their hands touched and neither wanted to let go. A moment alone in a palace gallery where they stood before a painting and spoke of beauty and longing in careful metaphors. A rainy afternoon when their carriages happened to stop side by side on a narrow street, and they simply looked at each other through the windows, saying everything without words. Finally, on a spring evening in 1878, they met deliberately and alone for the first time. Umberto had arranged it through trusted intermediaries, ensuring absolute discretion. The location was a private villa on the outskirts of Rome, owned by a loyal friend who asked no questions. When Eugenia entered the room and saw Umberto standing by the window, no longer wearing his formal uniform, but dressed simply like any gentleman, something shifted in both of them. All the months of careful propriety, of stolen glances and coded conversations, culminated in this moment of truth. He told her he knew this was wrong, that he had no right to ask anything of her, that she should leave immediately and forget this had ever happened. She replied that she'd been trying to forget him for 8 months, that she'd prayed for the feelings to fade, for duty and propriety to override what her heart insisted upon. But some things, once kindled, could not be extinguished by mere willpower. They stood 3 feet apart, the gulf between them filled with everything they couldn't say in public, everything that violated every rule they'd been taught since childhood. And then Umberto closed that distance, and they were in each other's arms, and the world with all its expectations and obligations fell away. What began that evening would continue for years, a secret romance conducted in the shadows of public life. They developed elaborate systems of communication, letters written in careful code and delivered by trusted servants, meetings arranged through intermediaries who could be counted on for absolute discretion, stolen hours in private villas, in remote country estates, in carefully chosen moments when the king's schedule could be adjusted without raising suspicion. It was a relationship built on fragments. An afternoon here, an evening there. Sometimes weeks would pass between encounters, separated by the demands of Umberto's position and the necessity of maintaining appearances. Each reunion was intense, charged with the accumulated longing of separation. Eugenia's letters to Umberto revealed a woman of remarkable depth. She wrote of philosophy and politics, of the books she was reading and the ideas that fascinated her. She questioned the social structures that confined women to ornamental roles. She dreamed of a world where passion and intellect could coexist with duty, where the heart's truth didn't have to be sacrificed to society's expectations. Umberto, in his responses, revealed a side of himself he could show to no one else. Not the formal king performing his constitutional duties, but a man wrestling with the contradiction of his position. He had absolute power in theory, but was constrained by tradition, by advisors, by the constant surveillance of public life. With Eugenia, he could be uncertain, vulnerable, human. The strain of maintaining two lives took its toll on both of them. Eugenia's marriage to Count Bolognini became increasingly hollow. He was not a cruel man, simply an old one who'd wanted a young wife to ornament his declining years. He spent most of his time at his country estate, leaving Eugenia in their Roman palazzo, and seemed content with the arrangement as long as appearances were maintained. But appearances required constant vigilance. Eugenia had to be seen at social functions, had to maintain friendships with other noble women, had to pretend interest in the trivial concerns of society while her real life existed in secret moments with the king. The Catholic Church loomed over everything. Both Umberto and Eugenia were believers, raised in a faith that condemned adultery as mortal sin. The guilt was a constant companion, especially for Eugenia, who spent hours in confession, though she could never confess the specific nature of her sin without destroying everything. One priest, Father Antonio, who served as her confessor, seemed to understand without being told. He spoke to her of God's mercy, of the complexity of human hearts, of the difference between sins of selfishness and sins of love. He couldn't absolve her, but he offered something almost as valuable, the reminder that she was not beyond redemption, that God's judgment might be gentler than society's. Meanwhile, Italy itself was in turmoil. The young kingdom faced constant challenges, conflicts between church and state, economic struggles, regional tensions between North and South, anarchist movements that saw the monarchy as oppressive. Umberto faced assassination attempts, political crises, the endless grinding pressure of holding a fragile nation together. Through it all, Eugenia was his refuge. In her presence, he could set down the burden of the crown, could speak freely about his doubts and fears, could be comforted without having to maintain the stoic facade expected of a king. She, in turn, found in him something she'd never known. Not just romantic love, but intellectual partnership. Umberto valued her opinions, discussed state matters with her, treated her mind with the respect society denied women. In their private world, she was his equal, his partner, not just a mistress, but a companion of the spirit. They developed rituals of intimacy that went beyond the physical, reading poetry aloud to each other, discussing the philosophies of Dante and Petrarch, playing chess with fierce competitive spirit, walking in private gardens at dawn, those precious hours when the world still slept and they could be simply themselves. Eugenia kept a private journal, hidden carefully in her chambers, where she recorded these moments. Not the scandalous details that society would have devoured, but the small truths that made up a life. The way Umberto laughed at her wit, the intensity of his focus when she spoke, the gentleness of his hands, the rare vulnerability when he spoke of his father's death and the weight of the crown. These pages, discovered decades later, would reveal what the history books could not, the genuine depth of feeling between them, the meeting of minds as much as hearts. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, are fragile things. In 1885, rumors began to circulate. Nothing concrete, nothing that could be proven, but whispers and drawing. Rooms and knowing glances at court functions. Eugenia's name was mentioned a bit too often in connection with the king. Their absences from certain events coincided too frequently. Queen Margherita, who had long suspected, now faced a dilemma. She could create a scandal by confronting the situation directly, or she could maintain the fiction of ignorance and keep the family's dignity intact. She chose the latter, but her coldness toward both Umberto and Eugenia became more pronounced. The king's advisors began to worry, not out of moral concern, but political calculation. A scandal could weaken the monarchy at a time when it was already facing challenges from Republican movements. They urged Umberto to be more careful, to perhaps end the relationship entirely. Umberto met with Eugenia in their usual villa and told her what his advisors had said. For the first time in their years together, they discussed the possibility of ending things, of returning to their separate, proper lives, of sacrificing what they'd found together on the altar of duty and appearances. Eugenia listened in silence, her face composed in the way she'd learned over years of navigating society. Then she asked him a simple question. Could he do it? Could he go back to seeing her only at formal events, to exchanging only polite pleasantries, to pretending she was nothing more than one face among many at court? Umberto couldn't answer, or rather, his silence was his answer. She smiled sadly and said she'd known, because she couldn't do it either. They'd crossed a threshold years ago, and there was no uncrossing it. They would have to be more careful, more discreet, but she would not give him up. Not for propriety, not for safety, not for anything. The relationship continued, but with increased caution. Meetings became less frequent and more carefully planned. Letters were destroyed immediately after reading. The trusted circle of Confederates who enabled their encounters was kept as small as possible. And yet, paradoxically, the increased risk seemed to deepen their connection. Each meeting carried the weight of sacrifice, of danger, of the constant possibility of discovery. What they shared had been tested by time and circumstance and had not merely survived but strengthened. Years continued to pass. Italy modernized. The kingdom stabilized. Umberto aged from a young king into a mature monarch, gray threading through his hair, lines deepening around his eyes. Eugenia, too, moved through her 30s into her 40s, her beauty evolving from youthful radiance to something richer and more complex. Their passion, rather than fading with familiarity, transformed into something deeper. The urgency of early desire gave way to profound intimacy. They knew each other's thoughts, could communicate with glances, had built between them a private world that was more real than the public roles they played. To the world, Umberto remained the dutiful king. He appeared in public with Queen Margherita, attended state functions, received foreign dignitaries, worked on matters of governance. Their marriage was cold, but functional, a public partnership, if not a private one. Margherita had her own life, her own interests, her own suspected indiscretions, though she was far more discreet than to let them become common knowledge. It was an arrangement understood, if not spoken, by the highest levels of society. A civilized accommodation to human weakness, as long as the forms were observed. But Eugenia paid a higher price for their love. She was invited to fewer intimate gatherings. Other women whispered about her, speculation replacing certainty in their gossip. Her reputation, while not destroyed, was compromised. Some doors closed to her. Some former friends became distant. She bore it with dignity, never confirming or denying the rumors, maintaining her composure even as society's judgment pressed down upon her. On July 29th, 1900, King Umberto traveled to Monza for an athletic event. It was a warm summer evening, and he was in good spirits. He'd seen Eugenia just 3 days before, one of their secret meetings in a villa outside Milan. She'd told him she had a strange feeling of foreboding, asked him to be careful. He'd laughed and kissed her concerns away, promising to be safe. At 10:30 that evening, an anarchist named Gaetano Bresci stepped from the crowd and fired 3 shots into the king's body. Umberto died within minutes, slumped in his carriage, blood spreading across his formal uniform. His last words were of concern for his wife and his son, the crown prince who would now become king. In Rome, Eugenia learned of his death through official channels, like everyone else. She was not at his bedside, could not attend him in his final moments, could not say goodbye. Her grief had to be private, hidden, unexpressed in any public way that might confirm what everyone suspected. At the state funeral, Eugenia stood among the nobility, her face a mask of appropriate sorrow, but nothing more. She could not weep openly, could not wear the black of a widow, though she felt herself more widowed than many who did, could not claim the right to public mourning for the man she'd loved for over 20 years. Queen Margherita, now the Queen Mother, stood in formal grief at the head of the procession. Whatever her private feelings about her husband's infidelity, whatever pain their marriage had caused her, she was now the widow of a murdered king, and society rallied around her. Eugenia's pain was invisible, and perhaps that made it worse. In the months that followed, Eugenia retreated from society. She spent time at her country estates, away from Rome and its memories. She sorted through the letters she'd kept hidden for years, reading them one final time before burning them, as she'd promised Umberto she would if anything happened to him. Watching his words turn to ash and smoke, she felt as if she were burning away a part of her own soul. Count Bolognini died 2 years later, leaving Eugenia a wealthy widow. She could have remarried. Several men of appropriate rank expressed interest, but she never did. Her heart had been given once, completely, and she would not pretend otherwise. Instead, she began to write. Not the scandalous memoir society might have expected, but philosophical essays and poetry. She wrote about love and duty, about the price of passion, about the ways society constrained women's lives. She published under a pseudonym, and her work was well received by critics who had no idea they were reading the thoughts of the king's former mistress. In her private journal, the one she kept locked away, she wrote more honestly about what she and Umberto had shared, about the beauty and the pain of loving someone you could never fully claim, about the moments of perfect happiness stolen from the jaws of propriety. She lived to see Italy transform, saw the monarchy survive World War I, though weakened, saw women begin to gain rights and recognition she'd only dreamed of, saw the slow erosion of the strict social codes that had made her love for Umberto such a dangerous secret. She died in 1934, at the age of 82, in her palazzo in Rome. Among her effects, her family found the journal and the few letters she hadn't been able to bring herself to burn. They also found a locket containing a small portrait of King Umberto, worn so often that the image had begun to fade. The family, after much debate, chose to keep these items private, to protect Eugenia's memory, to avoid reopening old scandals. The papers were locked away in the family archives, where they remained for decades. It wasn't until the 1990s that a historian researching the social life of the Italian court was granted access to the Attendolo Bolognini family papers. What emerged was the story of a love that had been hidden for nearly a century. Not a sordid affair of mere physical passion, but a genuine connection between two people trapped by the circumstances of their birth and position. The letters revealed Eugenia to be far more than a royal mistress. She was a woman of intellect and depth, whose influence on Umberto extended to matters of state and policy. She'd been, in effect, an unofficial advisor, offering perspectives he couldn't get from his male counselors who saw the world through the lens of privilege. Umberto's letters showed a man far more complex than his public image suggested. Thoughtful, conflicted, deeply aware of the contradictions between his personal desires and his public duties. He'd loved Eugenia genuinely, not as an escape from responsibility, but as a source of strength that allowed him to bear those responsibilities. Today, historians debate what their relationship means in the context of Italian history. Some see it as a scandalous example of royal excess, proof that monarchs considered themselves above the rules that governed ordinary people. Others view it as a tragic love story, two people caught in a system that denied them the right to their own hearts. But perhaps it's something more complex than either interpretation allows. Perhaps it's a reminder that beneath every crown, every title, every public role, there beats a human heart with all its capacity for love and suffering. That the grand narratives of history are built on individual stories of people trying to navigate the impossible terrain between duty and desire. In Rome today, if you know where to look, you can find the villa where they met. It's been converted to other uses now. It's romantic history forgotten by most. But sometimes in the late afternoon, when the light slants golden through the windows, you might imagine you can feel something of what they felt. The intensity of stolen moments. The bittersweet knowledge that this happiness, however real, existed in borrowed time. There's no official monument to their love. No plaque commemorating what they shared. History's public face records King Umberto as a dutiful monarch who died tragically at an assassin's hand. It mentions Queen Margherita, but says little of Eugenia beyond her presence at court. But in the private archives, in the letters and journals kept hidden for so long, there exists another history. A secret history written in passion and pain, in stolen hours and impossible choices. The story of a king who found in a forbidden love something he could never find on a throne, and a woman who loved him enough to bear the cost of that love in silence. Their story reminds us that every age has its rules, its expectations, its boundaries of acceptable behavior. And in every age, there are those whose hearts refuse to be bound by such limitations, who choose love despite the price, who build private worlds of meaning in the shadows of public life. Were they wrong? Society of their time would have said yes without hesitation. Modern sensibilities might be more forgiving, though still uncertain. But perhaps the question of right and wrong misses the deeper truth. They were simply human, flawed and genuine, trapped by circumstance, but determined to claim what happiness they could. And in the end, isn't that the story of most lives, royal or common? The struggle to be true to one's heart while meeting the demands the world places upon us. King Umberto and Eugenia Attendolo Bolognini. A passion in the royal shadows. A love that history tried to forget but couldn't quite erase. Their story survives in whispers and archives, in faded letters and worn lockets, in a persistent human need to believe that love, even impossible love, means something, matters somehow, leaves a mark on the world that time cannot completely erase.